welcome back again. Please comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is. Feel free to like the video too. Let's get to it. In 1940s London, people vanished without leaving a trace. Their homes were sold, their belongings forged away, and their bodies gone. No blood, no remains, just silence. How could anyone erase a person so completely? This is the story of John George Haigh, the man who believed acid was the perfect solution to murder. But why did a petty fraudster suddenly transform into a calculating killer who thought he'd found the ultimate loophole? The answer lies not just in the acid baths, but in his mind, twisted, desperate, and shockingly logical. How could the quiet son of religious parents grow into one of Britain's most infamous killers? John George Haigh was born in Stamford, Lincolnshire, in 1909, into a household that belonged to the Plymouth Brethren. This sect held to an extreme form of separation from the outside world. Members were taught strict discipline, with little allowance for outside pleasure or casual social ties. Children raised in such an environment often grew up removed from normal friendships, and Haigh's childhood was marked by this same boundary. The community believed in hard work, obedience, and fear of worldly corruption. For a boy like Haigh, daily life was structured and heavily supervised, and ordinary pastimes that seemed harmless in other families were discouraged or condemned. He later claimed that, as a child, he was plagued by recurring nightmares, often describing visions of blood and strange, dreamlike horrors. Stories of those nightmares added a darker undertone to a boyhood already set against a rigid religious background. Despite that, he seemed outwardly talented and even refined. Haigh developed a strong interest in music, and he learned to play the piano with skill. His taste leaned toward classical pieces, and people who knew him as a young man sometimes described him as cultured. He attended concerts and seemed to appreciate the arts in a way that many of his peers did not. Music gave him a mask of sophistication, and in social settings, it was easy for others to see him as an urbane, pleasant presence. By appearance and manners, there was little to suggest the trouble underneath. In many respects, that outward charm would later become one of his main tools for deception. He looked and sounded like a man who could be trusted, even admired. But trust in Haigh would always be misplaced. Behind the display of culture, Haigh showed a pattern of dishonesty from an early age. One of the first significant incidents came when he was just 21. He lost a job after being suspected of taking money from a cash box. It was never proved in court, but the suspicion alone was enough to cost him employment and cast light on his careless attitude toward honesty. Friends and family may have looked on this episode as a mistake or indiscretion, but in truth, it was an early glimpse of his willingness to take what did not belong to him. Small dishonesty, if repeated, can become a kind of rehearsal for larger fraud, and for Haigh, that appeared to be the pattern. It was not long after this that he turned to forgery, making false car documents and attempting to profit by trickery. Forgery was not recklessness alone, but an act of careful deceit. It implied planning, patient handwriting, and a cold recognition that other people's losses would become his gain. The contrast was stark. On the one hand, he presented himself as controlled, clean-cut, with polished skill at the piano and a taste for respectable company. On the other, he carried out thefts and false dealings that showed disregard for law and social obligation. Many later psychologists who studied similar cases have pointed to the role of childhood experiences in shaping this path. A strict and isolating religious environment can leave children feeling cut off from natural development, where guilt and secrecy take the place of openness. For some individuals, this can feed resentment or create a hidden world of fantasy and deception. Haigh's vivid dreams and early acts of fraud fit such a pattern. They showed how one could lead a double existence, balancing the outward expectation of a devout upbringing with a growing taste for manipulation. Research into deviant behavior notes that extreme parental control often prevents children from developing skills to handle conflict in normal ways. Instead of trust and open dialogue, the child learns to conceal, to lie, and to satisfy desires out of sight. Haigh's case is a textbook example of this process. While his parents enforced moral lessons and separation, he learned something different, the art of hiding. He began to use charm, music, and polished manners to project normalcy, but his real tendencies leaked through every act of fraud he tried. The unsettled question is whether his disturbing nightmares reflected his own guilt, or were fragments of violent imagination that would later spill into his crimes. Either way, they fed into a sense of self-alienation. As he grew older, the mask of culture and skill covered a restless urge to trick and take. By the time he reached adulthood, the cracks were obvious. Losing jobs for dishonesty, forging documents, and deceiving others were not isolated mistakes but signs of habit. It was not only a matter of breaking rules for quick profit, it showed a deeper pattern of valuing lies as a tool. Fraud, for Haigh, was not an occasional shortcut but a lifestyle in the making. Music and charm gained him trust, while his hands quietly wrote false papers or rifled through cash boxes. This habit of gaining a surface reputation while running a hidden scheme would follow him into every later stage of life. What might look like duality, respectability at the front and crime in the shadow, was in fact his chosen way of living. To him, deception was not a last resort, but the easiest and most natural option. Seeing him this way helps explain how he could rise from suspected theft in his 20s to fraud cases that destroyed his early marriage and sent him behind bars. The socially acceptable surface remained vital. Without his performance of respectability, his frauds would not have worked. But when he was caught, the disgrace was total. In time, instead of abandoning trickery, he doubled down, perfecting the skill of faking documents, identities, and appearances. Many people born into strict and isolating surroundings struggle to balance cultural expectations with personal urges. Yet only some turn that conflict into lifelong deception. Haigh, by his own early acts and his disturbing imagination, showed himself to be one of them. The childhood haunted by harsh rules and strange nightmares planted in him a secret life of fraud, and that secret life only grew when he stepped into adulthood. Those early warning signs, dishonesty, deception, forged papers, suspected theft, were not trivial mistakes. They were the beginning of the path that would later widen into murder. What happens when lies catch up before a man even turns 30? For John Haigh, the answer came quickly, and it cost him both his marriage and his freedom. In July 1934, he married a young woman named Beatrice Betty Hamer, and for a brief time, it looked as though he might follow a more conventional path. Yet stability was never something he could maintain. Just months into the marriage, his double life as a fraudster surfaced. Arrest and conviction followed, and while he was serving his sentence, Betty gave birth to their daughter. The child was placed for adoption soon after, and Haigh never saw either of them again. The marriage effectively dissolved before the ink on the certificate was dry. This was not just a personal setback. It cut him off from the traditional family ties that might have anchored him, leaving only isolation and growing resentment. The conviction that landed him in prison for the first time was tied to forgery, the same habit he had honed in his early years. Haigh had been falsifying documents for cars, a bold but sloppy operation that collapsed under scrutiny. Once inside prison, he met the reality of a British penal system designed to punish rather than reform. Inmates lived in overcrowded and austere conditions, stripped of individuality and subjected to routines aimed at deterrence. There was little in the way of rehabilitation programs, and men are often left as hardened criminals rather than reformed citizens. For Haigh, the experience did not so much scare him straight as it did sharpen his sense of grievance and his interest in deception as a career. Prison yards and bleak cells had their own hierarchy. To survive, one either kept one's head down or found ways to adapt. Haigh adapted, but in his case, he did not turn to humility. He learned instead how criminals spoke, how they carried themselves, and how prison hardened them to pity or regret. He was a quick observer, cataloguing what gained respect and what made someone appear weak. In that social climate, remorse was unfashionable. Cunning, however, could make a man stand out. Although he lacked physical toughness, he compensated with plans, schemes, and a presentation of intelligence that some others lacked. For Betty, the consequences were immediate and lasting. She had married expecting security, but instead soon found herself a single mother whose child had been put up for adoption. To distance herself from disgrace, she separated from Haigh completely. Haigh's family, already troubled by his behavior, took steps to sever ties as well. He emerged from prison not only without a wife or child, but also without parental support. His place in society had drastically shifted in just a few years. Where once he was the polished young man who could play piano and charm acquaintances, he was now a marked fraudster, with no career, no family, and a record hanging over him. That loss of social standing mattered because it set the stage for his growing reliance on schemes to regain what he had squandered. By 1936, Haigh had quietly shifted to new ground in London. At first glance, this looked like opportunity. In reality, he carried with him a ruined reputation. Wartime Britain was a country where trust and rationing shaped daily life. Jobs were scarce, communities knew one another closely, and someone with a prison sentence behind them stood out quickly. Haigh compensated by hiding his past and inventing new identities. His move to London gave him anonymity, but it also kept him away from whatever small connections might have reminded him of stability. London was vast, crowded, and filled with chances to disappear into the background. For someone like Haigh, it was an environment that encouraged testing boundaries. Haigh later found employment as a chauffeur with William McSwan, who ran amusement arcades. Being near wealthy individuals fed his appetite for comfort and money, and it was here he saw firsthand what kind of lifestyle wealth could give. It also showed him how fraud could be scaled. He began copying the manners and speech of the people riding in the back of the cars he drove. He did not just watch, he studied, and he realized financial fraud could offer him more than car forgeries ever could. By creating convincing paperwork and presenting himself with confidence, he could trick people who believed they were dealing with a respectable man. That realization became the blueprint he carried into his next schemes. Not long after, he adopted the name William Cato Adamson, falsely presenting himself as a solicitor. With this role, he set up what looked like legal offices in Surrey, London, and Sussex. The mask was convincing enough for clients, who believed they were buying shares from estates of deceased people. In truth, the estates were fabricated, and the paperwork was entirely forged. Here, Haigh advanced in sophistication. It was no longer a petty forgery of car registrations. Now, it was an entire fictional business, complete with false offices and documents. The irony is that such confidence sometimes created vulnerability. When you assume greater risk, a single oversight can undo everything. Just as before, his mistake was basic, an error in spelling that exposed the forgery. The word Guildford was written as Guildford in these official letters, and from there, the unraveling was swift. The exposure led to another 4-year prison sentence. This was no short stay, and the longer punishment deepened his estrangement from regular society. Wartime conditions made this even sharper. While ordinary men his age were conscripted or working in vital industries, Haigh spent those years marked as a fraudster and inmate. To the outside world, he was absent, his name linked to disgrace. Psychologists who study criminal behavior often observe that repeated imprisonment can harden identity. When a man returns to prison again and again, he can start to see himself as beyond ordinary life, someone permanently outside society's rules. That outlook then justifies the next crime. For Haigh, this repeated cycle meant he no longer saw crime as risk. He began to see it as the only path available. Inside prison walls, he continued to refine his methods. Letters, signatures, documents, each became practice for him, with small details to correct for the next run. He learned how to speak like someone in power. He realized the value of small signs of status, like polished speech or correct phrasing on legal documents. Being locked away gave him the time to study and plan. When he stepped out, he was not shamed or humbled, but more determined than before. His criminal identity had been molded and reinforced, not erased. By the time he walked free again, the world outside had changed. Britain was at war, rationing had taken hold, and families were often disrupted by loss and absence. These conditions mattered because they created new gaps to exploit. Disruptions in records, hurried transactions, and distracted authorities meant that sharp fraudsters had more room to maneuver. Haigh saw opportunity. Isolation at home, combined with damaged reputation, had left him little chance to reintegrate. A man who had failed at marriage, been severed from his family, and recognized as a fraud inside the prison system, now stood at a crossroads in a fractured society. He did not choose to rebuild. He chose instead to adapt his earlier tricks to a city teeming with possibility. London became the stage where his past dishonesty and growing ambition would merge into something darker. The line between fraud and violence was about to blur. He was no longer satisfied with simply falsifying estates or taking money through forged papers. His next steps would show how fraud, when paired with desperation and cold calculation, could escalate into something far more deadly. How could a misspelled word bring down a con artist's entire empire? For John George Haigh, that single blunder exposed a scheme he had built with patience and precision. By the mid-1930s, fresh out of prison and trying to reinvent himself yet again, he came to London under a new name. This time, he did not choose the path of a petty forger or car salesman. He went bigger. Haigh adopted the identity of William Cato Adamson, presenting himself as a solicitor with offices spread across London, Surrey, Guildford, and Hastings. On letterheads, on business cards, and in every manner of correspondence, he was no longer a disgraced man with a prison record. He was a figure of law, someone who could be trusted to handle paperwork, money, and complicated arrangements. That kind of disguise required commitment. It also required confidence. He had both, at least until his own carelessness chipped it away. To build the illusion, Haigh furnished offices, hired secretaries when needed, and even used professional stationery that bore the name Adamson in heavy print. Clients walked in and saw tidy rooms, desks stacked with papers, and folders that carried the marks of official legal business. He presented himself with formality, wore the right clothes, and adopted the speech patterns of men educated in law. One detail that always worked for him was his manner. He knew how to sound convincing, even when pressed with questions. That polish, combined with the office facade, gave him a credibility that many desperate clients did not think to test. A solicitor with multiple offices could handle the complicated matters of estate law. Or at least, that was the image he created. The scheme itself was not crude. Haigh claimed he had access to estates of wealthy clients who had died without heirs. Through supposed legal loopholes, shares from these estates could be transferred at discounted prices. To uninformed investors or family contacts, this sounded appealing. Why deal with the red tape of normal channels if a trusted solicitor could quietly sell you privileged assets? Haigh understood that it was easier to fool people when they felt like they were stepping into something exclusive. Secrecy always added value. Most of his customers were convinced enough to hand over cash, secure in the belief that they were investing wisely. In reality, every estate was fabricated. The assets only existed on paper, drafted and signed by Haigh's hand. With enough forged seals, letterheads, and formal phrasing, the documents looked official. It was a scam run with sophistication, an operation far beyond the car forgeries of his earlier years. For all its polish, his empire had one flaw. On some of his official papers, Haigh typed the name of the town Guildford as Guildford. To almost any eye, the slip might seem small, but in legal correspondence, especially documents tied to properties and estates, accuracy was everything. A single inconsistency could raise suspicion, and that is exactly what happened. Someone caught the spelling error, and in that overlooked detail, the deception unraveled. Investigators realized the mistake signaled something larger, that the solicitor's papers were not genuine. If a man working under the name of William Cato Adamson could not even spell Guildford correctly, what else was false? Haigh's carefully built front collapsed quickly. The authorities dug into his operations, and it became clear that the solicitor's identity was an invention. None of the estates were real. The clients who supposedly left behind stocks and assets had never existed. All of it was lines of ink on paper, no more legitimate than the car forgeries that had first placed him in trial years earlier. This time, though, the scope was greater, and so was the punishment. The courts sentenced him to 4 years in prison for fraud. Another stretch behind walls awaited him. By 1939, when Britain prepared for war, Haigh was yet again in custody. His dreams of carving out a respectable appearance in society through deceit had been exposed. At the time, prison was not a mild experience. Long hours, little comfort, and rigid rules wore on men. Rehabilitation in any true sense was absent. The system emphasized order, punishment, and containment. Inmates like Haigh were made to face the monotony of confinement, with scarce opportunity for actual training or reintegration. Yet for him, prison became another classroom. The 4 years were not wasted from his point of view. They gave him long stretches of time to think, to plan, and to refine. He practiced drafting letters that read more professionally. He studied how flaws in his approach, like the spelling mistake, could betray him. Instead of regarding forgery as something to adjust, he began to treat it as a craft, an art form where precision meant survival. More than his skills with paperwork, prison hardened his outlook. He entered blaming chance and lapses of detail. He left seeing fraud as his true calling. In that hardened view, respectability in normal work was no longer an option. To him, deception was not a side road but the main path forward. He looked at businessmen, landlords and officials, not as respectable people but as future marks. He absorbed lessons from others inside, men who shared their own stories of scams, robberies, or ways of cheating the system. In place of reform, he found education. For someone with his natural charm and ability to present as refined, the combination was potent. Looking back, this prison term stands out not only for the fraud itself, but for what it represented. It showed how far Haigh was willing to go to invent an entire life, complete with legal offices, false estates, and fabricated shares. It also revealed a growing arrogance. To impersonate a solicitor is to assume the trust of one of the most respected professions, and by the time of his exposure, he seemed confident he could keep the game running without flaws. Confidence is often the undoing of men like him. A word misspelled, a careless slip, became enough to undo everything. But when the walls closed in, Haigh did not learn restraint. He learned only to be sharper next time. As war raged outside during his incarceration, Haigh watched as the world shifted. Families lost members, records were disordered, and chaos stretched across Britain. He recognized that future opportunities would emerge from this disorder. Where others saw tragedy, he saw advantage. That kind of mindset, viewing crisis as a chance to manipulate, would guide him when free again. Fraud alone had proved profitable, but it also had limits. Prison was the price of getting caught. He began thinking of ways to erase risk entirely, not stop playing the game but change the rules. If victims could vanish without evidence, then forged documents would look stronger and questions would fade. He no longer considered mistakes like the Guildford slip as fatal, but as signs to close loopholes. By the time he was preparing for release, Haigh was not the man who first stepped into London with an alias. He was more practiced, more resentful, and more determined. The title of solicitor had been stolen to mask deception, and paperwork had proven useful, but fraud alone was becoming too fragile. His next stage would combine the paperwork tricks, the falsified records, and the charm with something more final. Instead of relying on lies alone, he would soon rely on murder, pairing fraud with physical erasure. In his mind, to eliminate risk from fraud meant to eliminate people. That leap is what awaited him once he left the prison walls behind. How could someone disappear during wartime Britain without raising alarm? In the summer of 1944, the country was still in the grip of air raids, rationing, and the disruption that came with a global conflict. In that climate, people moved in and out of cities constantly, and news of missing individuals could often pass without immediate concern. John George Haigh understood this, and he saw in it an opening to cover his tracks. He had already lived as a fraudster, creating false identities and official-looking documents, but now he was ready for something new. The frauds alone had brought him money and time in prison, but prison taught him how fragile those plans really were. He wanted a way to keep the profits, but erase the risk of discovery. In his mind, the solution was simple. No victim meant no crime could be proven. Haigh knew who his first target would be. William Donald McSwan was not a stranger. Years earlier, Haigh had worked as a chauffeur for his father, Donald McSwan, who ran in wealthy circles through his business in amusement arcades. During that time, Haigh became acquainted with William. By 1944, McSwan was a man of means, benefiting from his parents' successful business and owning properties that brought in a steady flow of rent. To a man like Haigh, who now moved in and out of schemes but never held on to wealth, McSwan looked like the perfect starting point. And wartime Britain, with its chaos and populations constantly shifting, gave cover to what he planned next. In September 1944, Haigh arranged a reunion with McSwan. He was charming, as usual, presenting himself as a friend interested in catching up. The meeting took place at a basement property on Gloucester Road, a location away from the watchful eyes of neighbours or passers-by. What McSwan did not know was that Haigh had already brought a heavy lead pipe with him. The trap was set before McSwan even arrived. When the moment came, Haigh struck him fatally. There was no dramatic chase or drawn-out fight. Quick violence, then silence. By killing him in the basement, Haigh had chosen privacy from the start. But the real method for covering up the crime was yet to come. What followed turned his fraud into something altogether different. At the property, Haigh kept a large 40-gallon steel drum, and inside it, he poured concentrated sulfuric acid. This acid was extremely corrosive, capable of burning through skin and dissolving flesh at a frightening pace. When used in sufficient amounts, it could reduce an entire body to liquid. Haigh placed McSwan's body into the drum, covered it with acid, and left the chemical process to begin. Within 2 days, most of the body had been broken down, reduced to a dark sludge. For the final step, Haigh tipped the remains into a manhole nearby. Where others might bury or burn a body and leave traces, Haigh left nothing that could be recovered. For him, this was the clean solution, the loophole to erase not only the victim, but the crime itself. It was this act that marked the turning point in his life of crime. He had shifted from forgeries and frauds, where victims left behind complaints and charges, to a crime where he believed victims left nothing at all. This reasoning gave him justification in his own mind. To Haigh, murder was only an extension of fraud. The death of the victim meant no lawsuit, no charges, and no paper trail to undo his plans. It was deception taken to the final step. In his twisted logic, it was not just violence for its own sake, it was removing the evidence. To him, it was efficient, and above all, safe. After the act, he faced the challenge of explaining McSwan's absence. Here, the wartime conditions worked in his favour. Haigh told McSwan's parents that their son had gone away to Scotland, hiding out to avoid being called up for military service. At the time, draft evasion was not a rare excuse. Families knew men who had run, deserted, or quietly disappeared to avoid the fighting abroad. For the McSwans, alive in a country stretched thin by conscription, this was plausible. They did not go to the police, and they accepted Haigh's word. That simple lie gave him breathing room to step into William's affairs. Once McSwan was out of the picture, Haigh moved to secure his rents and properties. Payments once directed to William now flowed under Haigh's control. He forged documents when needed, collecting the money with ease. The fraud was the same scheme he had run before, but now without the risk of the victim showing up to expose it. McSwan's absence was explained away. His body dissolved, and Haigh found himself holding funds that gave him freedom. The combination seemed to prove his theory correct. Fraud, combined with murder, was safer than fraud alone. Still, this crime should not be understood as an act of desperation only. It was also an experiment. Haigh wanted to see if his acid method would truly erase every trace. He proved to himself it could. By the time the manhole carried away the last of McSwan's remains, only small fragments lingered, a detail he brushed aside as negligible. He had watched the acid work, and he trusted it. The man who had once been cautious about signatures and spelling mistakes now saw no limit. Acid had given him a way to erase evidence completely, far more decisive than shredding papers or hiding documents. He believed he had found the perfect solution. Wartime Britain was a strange landscape to test such a crime. Blackouts left streets dark at night. Neighbours were absent for long stretches of time, and government focus leaned heavily on keeping the country running under attack. Missing individuals could get lost in the chaos, especially younger men who might be explained away as draft evaders. Haigh played directly into that environment. The timing helped him. Had it been peacetime, a wealthy man vanishing from London might have sparked faster questions. But in 1944, the country was stretched thin, and those gaps made it easier for Haigh to slip through unnoticed. This was not just a disappearance. It became the template for all his later crimes. Each element would return again. The lure into an isolated space, the fatal strike with confidence, the acid bath to erase the evidence, and the cover story provided to families or friends. Above all, it proved to him that he could not only profit, but do so without fear of trial. The rules had changed in his eyes. Fraud had limits, but fraud tied to murder had none. For William Donald McSwan, the meeting at Gloucester Road was the last time he was seen alive. For John George Haigh, it was the first time killing merged seamlessly with forgery. His calm after the crime, his ability to convince McSwan's parents of the false story, and his ease at collecting rents showed how quickly he adapted. He believed he had unlocked a method beyond discovery, and once the first attempt succeeded, nothing held him back from repeating it. Each success would only strengthen his certainty, moving him beyond a single victim to something larger, darker, and more ambitious. Why stop at one victim when silence meant more money? After William McSwan vanished without a trace, his parents, Donald and Amy McSwan, began pressing Haigh for answers. They asked about their son and wanted to know where he had gone. Haigh had already told them William had left to avoid being called up for military service, but the story was not enough to calm their questions. Every time he saw them, they wanted updates. For a man like Haigh, who thrived on having control over his victims, their persistence was a problem. He realized that silence would only come if the McSwans themselves were removed completely. Unlike William, they were older, but their property, wealth, and London holdings made them targets. In Haigh's view, their disappearance would solve two problems at once: end the questions and create even greater financial opportunity. The McSwans were owners of several properties in London, and William had been collecting rent on their behalf before his disappearance. That meant not only steady income, but assets that could be transferred or sold. Haigh had tasted the benefits of controlling William's financial affairs after his death, but to secure the full amount, he needed access to the whole portfolio. Donald and Amy stood in his way. Their wealth represented security, and their age made them less likely to escape or resist if approached carefully. More importantly, they trusted Haigh. They knew him through their son, and in wartime Britain, close ties like these meant a great deal. He presented himself as helpful, polite, and concerned. Their guard was down, and Haigh knew how to exploit that trust without hesitation. In September 1944, Haigh lured Donald McSwan on false pretenses. He invited him to his basement workshop, just as he had done with William. For Donald, nothing seemed unusual. Haigh was someone he knew, and the setting was presented as businesslike. Once inside, Haigh struck swiftly. Just as he had with William, he attacked with a blunt instrument, choosing speed and privacy over confrontation. When Donald had been killed, Haigh placed the body into a 40-gallon drum filled with sulfuric acid. He had tested this method already, and he trusted it. Over the course of 2 days, the acid worked to dissolve the body into a thick liquid. When the process finished, Haigh disposed of the remains into a manhole, once again eliminating physical evidence. With Donald gone, Haigh turned his focus to Amy. He knew she would soon ask questions when her husband failed to come home. For that reason, he acted quickly, contacting her with a false story that Donald had been delayed and asking her to meet. Believing the explanation, Amy followed him back to his workshop. Like her husband, she was struck down as soon as the opportunity presented itself. Her body was placed into a second drum of acid, and the process repeated. 2 members of the same family had vanished in the same week. Haigh had eliminated not just William, but his parents as well, giving him access to everything they controlled. The escalation from 1 victim to 3 exposed his growing dependence on murder as an extension of fraud. The pattern was as cold as it was deliberate. Haigh killed each victim in isolation, reused the same method, and then erased the evidence with acid. He relied on 2 things: privacy and trust. Both Donald and Amy walked into his workshop believing him, and once the drums were closed, they never walked out again. Perhaps most disturbing was how quickly Haigh repeated his process. Even with 2 corpses dissolving in drums, he was already thinking ahead about property transfers and the paper trail that would help him maintain control. While other men his age were fighting in the war or working to support families, Haigh was standing alone in a basement, surrounded by chemical fumes, planning the next step in seizing their money. With both parents gone, Haigh turned to paperwork. He forged signatures, created documents, and transferred assets as if Donald and Amy had willingly passed control. It was not a simple matter of carrying cash, but a coordinated effort to produce convincing records. Property deeds, signatures, and legal forms were his tools, just as much as the lead pipe and sulfuric acid were. By presenting the forgeries with authority, he managed to access their wealth quietly. In total, he gained around £8,000. This was a significant amount in wartime Britain, giving him luxury beyond rationing. He also collected belongings of value, including furniture, jewellery, and their car. In one particularly chilling act of normalcy, he even kept their dog as his own. To an outsider, he now appeared to be a man moving up in life, driving a better car, wearing finer clothes, and carrying himself with more wealth. The disappearance of the McSwans raised no immediate alarm. Wartime London was chaotic, and people vanished often. Evacuations, conscription, and the general dislocation of families gave room for excuses. Neighbours who might have asked questions assumed movements were connected to the war effort. With William supposedly hiding in Scotland and Donald and Amy absent, there was nothing obvious to trace back to Haigh. His cover stories continued to work, and the acid left nothing physical behind that could draw suspicion. For him, the crime validated his theory. Fraud on its own was never safe enough, but fraud coupled with murder and chemical disposal left no loose ends. Haigh now had money to spend, and he spent it freely. Expensive suits replaced the old ones. Better food, drinks, and entertainment became part of his routine. He drove the McSwan's car, treating it as his own. People around him saw wealth and assumed business success. The truth, however, was that every penny came from a family erased from existence. What made the crime distinctive was the scale of the escalation. From one young man, Haigh had leapt to wiping out his entire family. By targeting the parents along with the son, he showed there was no limit to what he would attempt if profit was at stake. This was not reactionary killing out of panic. These were deliberate murders carried out to gain wealth. The success of the plan reinforced his confidence. He had proven to himself that acid baths could hide bodies completely, that forged signatures could stand up to scrutiny, and that people would believe convenient stories in wartime. He had money, assets, and independence, all built on death. Importantly, he learned that silencing families was more profitable than killing individuals. Eliminating one victim left behind others to ask questions. Eliminating all directly involved made the questions stop. This lesson would guide his future decisions. He no longer thought in terms of single marks, but in terms of entire families, especially those wealthy enough to be worth the risk. As he enjoyed the profits, one other factor became apparent. Greed has no final limit. The £8,000 and belongings bought him time, but they did not satisfy him permanently. Within months, he began thinking about wealthier targets and grander schemes. If dissolving 3 people could secure him properties and money, what could 5 or 6 bring? The McSwan's disappearance marked a turning point, not just in his crimes but in his ambition. Haigh was no longer a fraudster disguising theft with papers. He was now a man who believed murder was simply a tool to manage his fraud. Every disappearance gave him more confidence, and every financial gain pushed him to consider wealthier and more connected victims. From that point onward, financial ambition and violence were inseparable in his life. Haigh had confirmed for himself that his method worked, and the profits demanded more. The next step was inevitable. If the McSwans' properties made him rich, wealthier couples and more valuable estates were waiting. He had moved from fraud into systematic murder for gain, building his life on the silence of his victims, and in the years that followed, his schemes only grew larger. Why would a serial fraudster risk everything by targeting a well-connected couple? In the years after the McSwan murders, John Haigh was living beyond his means. Wartime crime had covered some of his disappearances, but by 1947, the economy was shifting. Rationing tightened, people looked more closely at transactions, and smaller frauds did not bring in enough to keep his lifestyle afloat. He wanted comfort, the feel of wealth, and the respect that came with money. It was not just about quick profit anymore. He craved the security and luxury owned by people above his station. That desire led him to Archibald and Rosalie Henderson, a couple with money, connections, and valuable property. They seemed out of reach to most swindlers. To Haigh, they were the next step in a growing pattern. Haigh met the Hendersons through a blend of charm and business posturing. He presented himself as a property dealer, someone with professional skill who could advise on real estate. At the time, property was one of the most reliable investments available. The war had left much of London bomb damaged, and rebuilding efforts made property dealings lucrative. Families who held worthwhile homes or land often attracted people like Haigh, who claimed to have opportunities waiting. He leaned on respectability, the tailored suits, careful manners, and legal-style documents that persuaded people to see him as reliable. The Hendersons were comfortable in social circles, but they also wanted to make wise financial choices. They accepted Haigh's company, and he began spending more time in their presence to deepen that trust. One detail from these encounters stood out later. While visiting the Hendersons, Haigh noticed Archibald's revolver. Firearms were unusual in Britain, tightly controlled but not impossible to possess by men of means. Haigh quickly understood that the weapon could play two roles. It was tangible proof of Archibald's wealth, and useful as a tool for murder. On a visit, Haigh quietly slipped it away, keeping it for himself. It was a small theft, but it carried major weight. That revolver would ultimately serve as the instrument in taking both of their lives. The theft also showed how direct Haigh had become. Unlike earlier forgeries or staged papers, this was plain stealing from under his target's nose. It was a step that showed his growing boldness and his comfort in taking risks around people who trusted him. By February of 1948, John George Haigh had laid his plan. He rented another workspace in Crawley, Sussex. This workshop was isolated, a quiet unit where he stored drums of sulfuric acid, tools, and supplies. It was not his home or daily place of visible business, which made it ideal for what he was planning. With this setup ready, Haigh invited the Hendersons there under the guise of discussing property opportunities. They believed they were meeting a respectable businessman about real estate. There was no reason for them to suspect danger. The setting was private, but disguised as legitimate, the kind of place one might expect for confidential financial talks. Haigh had designed the trap as carefully as he had with William and the McSwans. Inside the Crawley workshop, the couple faced a fatal betrayal. Haigh used the revolver he had stolen from Archibald, shooting them each at close range. If earlier victims had been struck with blunt instruments before being dissolved in acid, this time Haigh executed the plan with a firearm. It was faster, quieter in terms of resistance, and left him with greater control over their bodies in the aftermath. Once they were dead, he returned to the method he had now refined, lowering the bodies into drums of concentrated sulfuric acid. Over 2 days, the acid reduced flesh and tissue to liquid sludge, leaving only traces of bone or dentures. As before, he disposed of the remains through drains and back areas near his workshop. For Haigh, that workshop was a controlled laboratory where crime could hide behind locked doors. Once the Hendersons ceased to exist physically, Haigh turned to the financial side. The real purpose of targeting them lay in their assets. This was not a random killing. It was designed entirely for gain. Through forged signatures and falsified paperwork, Haigh transferred their belongings to himself. He gained access to their home in West London, their car, jewellery, and other possessions. The fraud followed a similar script as before, but the scale was much greater. Haigh was no longer targeting the holdings of one young man or an elderly couple with modest rentals. He was taking over assets that signified high wealth. This gave him not just money but a stronger appearance of legitimacy. Outsiders might see him occupying a wealthy couple's residence, driving their car, and conclude he was truly a successful businessman. It was the image he had always wanted to project. Financial pressure drove these risks. By 1947 and 1948, Haigh had spent through much of the McSwan money. His taste for comfort demanded more. His willingness to escalate showed how greed had merged with murder into one continuous cycle. Fraud on its own could not support him. There was always the chance of being exposed by surviving victims. Murder solved that, in his mind, and the Hendersons looked like the right prize. It was his belief that acid eliminated all risk. He counted on there being no bodies, no crime that the law could prove, and no challenges to his forged documents. In that belief, he extended his frauds from middle-class estates to the world of wealthy property owners. Logistics were vital in making this possible. A house or a hotel room could never provide the privacy to dissolve bodies in acid. Neighbors, staff, and cleaners would notice fumes, stains, and unusual containers. The workshops he rented in locations like Crawley became essential. They allowed him to set up drums, store equipment, and lock himself away without interference. Sulfuric acid gave off strong fumes, and only a secluded space could conceal this. These workshops doubled as both crime scenes and laboratories, where careful handling of acid and timing allowed for complete erasure of victims. Without such spaces, his cycle of fraud and murder would have collapsed quickly. The Henderson murders symbolized the peak of Haigh's arrogance. He was no longer content to swindle through letters and forged signatures alone. He inserted himself into the lives of wealthy, socially connected people, then removed them with violence and converted their lives into assets under his name. This combination of charm in public, violence in private, and forged paperwork afterwards defined his method. It was fraud evolved into murder for profit, supported by workshops that hid acid drums in the shadows of ordinary English towns. To him, it proved he could take down not just vulnerable individuals, but couples with standing, money, and social ties. Yet success carried its own hidden dangers. The bolder the target, the more noticeable their disappearance. While wartime conditions had hidden earlier vanishing acts, post-war Britain was less forgiving. Friends, neighbours, and relatives began asking more questions when wealthy couples dropped out of sight. For Haigh, however, the Hendersons embodied the lure of high reward. Their loss gave him greater assets in the short term, but it also showed how his reliance on workshops and acid would have to remain perfectly managed if he hoped to continue. His method had become consistent, but his ambition kept pushing him toward riskier victims. And in time, that ambition would lead him to the victim whose disappearance finally broke the illusion that no trace could be left behind. What kind of place could hide both acid baths and human remains? For John George Haigh, the answer came in the form of rented workshops, out-of-the-way buildings that attracted little attention. These were not grand offices or ordinary homes. They were modest spaces, large enough to store industrial equipment, but quiet enough to allow him to work unnoticed. The first of these was located on Gloucester Road in London. To those who passed by, it looked like any ordinary workroom, but inside, it became the site where William McSwan and his parents met their deaths, their bodies lowered into drums of sulfuric acid. From the outside, nothing gave it away. No screaming sounds seeped through the walls, and no suspicious smoke poured out of the windows. The exterior promised only routine labour, yet what went on inside defined one of the most chilling crime methods of the 1940s. Later, after moving his focus away from Gloucester Road, Haigh settled on another hidden space in Crawley, Sussex. That site became equally important, especially during his attacks on Archibald and Rosalie Henderson. The Crawley workshop was nondescript, little more than a rented unit with solid walls and a lockable door. For Haigh, this was ideal. These properties had none of the built-in risks of hotels or boarding houses, where managers and cleaning staff would be quick to notice large containers filled with dangerous chemicals. Instead, the workshop offered privacy, and with privacy came the opportunity to carry out and conceal serious crimes. To anyone else walking by, it was a site for tradesmen, mechanics, or small-time business owners. To Haigh, it was a laboratory designed for erasing human beings. Managing these crimes required detail and planning. Sulfuric acid is highly corrosive, but it does not behave cleanly. It smokes, it gives off a sharp smell, and it corrodes the objects it touches. For Haigh to use it, he needed containers that would hold both acid and the bodies he wanted to destroy. This is why he favoured 40-gallon steel drums. They were large enough to contain an adult body when folded inside, and sturdy enough to withstand the acid without breaking apart too quickly. Once a victim was submerged, He left the process to work over 1 or 2 days, letting the body break down into sludge. When the remains were liquid, he simply poured them down nearby drains or manholes. The workshops came equipped with drainage systems designed for waste disposal. To a murderer with Haigh's plan, that detail was a perfect way to hide evidence. Every step was practical, mechanical, and disturbingly simple. Think about the setting. Cramped walls, a steel drum in the middle of the floor, acid bubbling inside, and careful hands steering the final act of disposal. Unlike homes or offices, which held furniture and decoration, the workshop stripped everything to bare function. There were no neighbours sharing a corridor, no cleaners checking bins, no guests dropping by unannounced. Haigh could take his time. Each detail of his crimes relied on this freedom. He could strike a victim quickly, haul the body to the drum, and leave it submerged behind a locked door. The fumes would have been overwhelming to most people, but Haigh returned time and again, convinced his system was foolproof. Hotels or residential houses carried risks he could not afford. The constant movement of others, the likelihood of smells being noticed, and the obvious suspicion of dragging drums through common halls all made them impossible. With workshops, these problems vanished. He could transport drums in vehicles, roll them directly inside, and be assured that nobody would ask questions. Workspaces of that size often held unusual equipment anyway, so a steel drum looked unremarkable in that context. Employees of nearby workshops may have assumed Haigh was storing chemicals or oils, both common for trades and repair work. It was the perfect disguise, because it required no disguise at all. His setup looked ordinary enough to blend seamlessly into the background of working-class industry. The timing also played in his favour. In the 1940s, public awareness of forensics was primitive by modern standards. Law enforcement officers understood fingerprints and basic cause of death, but chemical disposal of a body was beyond their routine expertise. There were no advanced DNA methods, no computer records tying missing person reports together in real time, and no rapid cross-referencing systems for financial fraud. That gap in scientific and bureaucratic oversight gave Haigh confidence. He believed that once acid dissolved a body, there would be no evidence left for police to find. Without a corpse, he assumed no charge could be brought. That belief was not completely irrational at the time, since most prosecutions did rely on physical remains to prove a murder had taken place. He turned the lack of forensic sophistication into his greatest advantage. Of course, in reality, acid left residues, and certain materials like dentures and bone sometimes survived. But in 1944 or 1947, this was not fully understood by police on the ground. Trained pathologists might recognize fragments, but without a clear body, a murder case seemed fragile. Haigh built his entire method on exploiting that weakness. Where other fraudsters tried to cover their paper trails, he went farther, covering the human trail that could lead the law back to him. These hidden workshops were not just storage sites. They became the machinery of his vanity, the places where he imagined himself untouchable, above law and detection. The Gloucester workshop carried the first lessons. 3 members of the McSwan family disappeared there, and when nothing remained to mark their deaths, Haigh's confidence surged. The Crawley workshop expanded those lessons further. By then, he had settled into a rhythm: kill, dissolve, forge documents, and move into the victim's financial life as if it were his own. While others saw everyday toolhouses, he saw engines of wealth. Each cramped workspace allowed him to maintain his double image, polished and respectable on the surface, surrounded by acid drums and chemical fumes in private. Both workshops were critical to his cycle. Without them, his methods would have stood out in hotels, homes, or other public spaces where witnesses could ask questions. At the same time, the workshops show how isolation shaped his confidence. Locked away with only acid drums and forged documents, he convinced himself of perfection. The very absence of discovery fueled this self-deception. Months and years passed without arrest, reinforcing his belief. He imagined himself cleverer than the law, standing on ground others had never even considered. Every victim targeted at Gloucester or Crawley was chosen knowing that those spaces gave him control. And each time he poured the dissolved sludge into drains, he thought of it as the final proof that nothing of his crimes existed anymore. In that sense, the workshops were the heart of his fantasy, the stage where illusion met brutality. Yet success carried its own weakness. While he believed himself hidden, the very secrecy of the workshops meant nobody had seen his crimes until it was too late. It also meant that when one future victim drew attention, the entire system of concealment could fall apart in an instant. Acid drums, locked rooms, and chemical fumes might hide crimes for a time, but questions from the outside world never stay suppressed forever. The Gloucester and Crawley sites were havens while they lasted. but Haig's pattern of control would eventually be pushed too far. He thought the workshops had made him invincible, yet soon he would choose a target whose disappearance could not be explained away so quietly. What happens when you kill someone who cannot so easily be explained away? For John George Haigh, that moment arrived in 1949 with the disappearance of Olive Durand Deacon. Up until then, he had targeted victims who were either socially isolated or could plausibly be excused as having vanished in wartime confusion. But Olive was not one of those people. She was a 69-year-old widow, known within her community and surrounded by acquaintances who paid attention to her routines. Unlike the McSwans or Hendersons, Olive's disappearance was never going to pass without notice, and that difference is what cracked Haigh's belief that acid baths could erase everything. Olive Durand Deacon lived in Kensington at the Onslow Court Hotel, the same lodging house where Haigh resided. The hotel contained residents of comfortable financial means, people who relied on an atmosphere of safety and respectability. Olive herself had lived a measured, predictable life there, often socializing with other residents. She had a reputation for being practical, observant, and fairly active for her age. Haigh, who posed as an engineer and inventor, used these interactions to draw her in. He often presented himself as someone developing new products or working on curious designs. That persona gave him credibility when he claimed he could help her with one of her own ideas. In early 1949, Olive approached Haigh about a design she had for a new kind of artificial fingernail. It was a small innovation, but she believed it could be commercially viable. Haigh encouraged her, telling her he had access to equipment and facilities where they could create prototypes. The idea suited him perfectly because it gave a natural excuse to lure her to his workshop away from the hotel. He suggested she accompany him to his space at Leopold Road in Crawley, where he supposedly kept the necessary tools. Olive, seeing him as a capable man with technical interests, agreed. On February 18th, 1949, Olive travelled with Haigh to the workshop. Once inside, she never left alive. Haigh used the Henderson's revolver, the pistol he had stolen during his earlier visits, to shoot her in the back of the neck. Unlike his first killing of William McSwan, this was not a strike with a blunt object, but a swift execution with a firearm. It was efficient, controlled, and gave him immediate dominance over the scene. After the gunshot, he placed her body into one of his drums filled with concentrated sulfuric acid, the same method he had been refining since 1944. Over the next 2 days, Olive's body was reduced to sludge, drained away through the workshop system. To Haigh, it was routine by now. He had developed a pattern of lures, killings, and acid disposal. But this murder was different in ways he underestimated. Olive Durand Deacon was not isolated. She lived among hotel residents who knew her well, and they noticed her absence almost instantly. When she didn't return to her usual circles, concern mounted. Within a day, her friends reported her missing to the police. This action, so unlike the reaction after his earlier crimes, was crucial. The disappearance of Olive could not be written off as wartime evasion, sudden travel, or estrangement. There was no convenient explanation, and people expected answers quickly. The police investigation began immediately, and suspicion soon fell on Haigh. He had been the last person seen with Olive, telling others at the hotel that they were going to Crawley together. Witnesses remembered this clearly, and the chain of events put him directly in their sights. When investigators searched his workshop, they found themselves inside a space that Haigh thought to be a perfect hiding ground. Instead, it became the place that revealed everything. Among acid drums and chemical stains, they discovered items that Olive had carried with her. Most important were her dentures, imperfectly destroyed by the acid and still clearly recognizable. Small fragments of bone also remained, overlooked or resistant to the full effect of the acid. These physical remnants represented what he had believed impossible, evidence surviving where none should have been left. Even more significant was a simple item of daily life, a dry cleaning ticket. Found in the pocket of Olive's coat inside the workshop, it directly connected her to the site where Haigh claimed nobody could trace her. That small scrap of paper, overlooked by Haigh in his disposal efforts, became one of the strongest links tying him to her disappearance. The combination of the ticket, denture fragments, and recovered substances from the acid drums dismantled his illusion of the perfect crime. Forensic tests of the sludge confirmed traces of human fat and other biological material, further grounding the case in science rather than theory. Haigh had always believed that no body, no crime was the rule he could exploit. Olive's disappearance proved otherwise. Her friend's vigilance and the speed of the missing persons report gave the police cause to act more swiftly than ever before. By investigating his fraud activities at the hotel and beyond, they matched his financial schemes with the timeline of her disappearance. For the first time, the fraud, the murder, and the method were all tied neatly together. In his past killings, gaps in records and limited social connections had kept questions from being asked. With Olive, those questions came hard and fast, leaving him no room to maneuver. The case against Haigh developed rapidly. Every forensic detail mattered. Acid could dissolve flesh and tissue, but not completely eliminate all physical signs. Police officers collected sludge samples from the drains and tested them. Chemical analysis confirmed the presence of human matter. The dentures, brittle but untouched by complete destruction, were given to Olive's dentist. They matched his patient records exactly, leaving no doubt about her identity. In an age where forensic science was considered limited, these pieces of proof carried enormous weight. They showed how small fragments could speak louder than total erasure. For Haigh, one flawed assumption had ended his run: the belief that families or friends would always accept a convenient explanation and never pursue questions. Olive's community proved the opposite. It was not just the police, but the human element. Those who noticed when she failed to show up and insisted something was wrong, that turned suspicion into a case. The story of her disappearance highlighted how detection does not always rely on sophisticated methods, but sometimes on simple awareness and determination. Had the residents of Onslow Court not reported her absence, Haigh might have bought himself more time. But in 1949, post-war life was beginning to stabilize, and missing people could not always be waved away with quick lies. The discovery of Olive's remains inside the Crawley workshop shocked investigators and cemented the trajectory of the investigation. By linking her to the acid drums and physical items left behind, they confirmed Haigh's responsibility. It was the first case where his shadow pattern of fraud and murder was fully revealed to the authorities. Every earlier disappearance that had gone unchallenged suddenly began to look suspicious. McSwan, his parents, and the Hendersons, people who had simply vanished, were now re-evaluated under the same light. Investigators tied the evidence of fraud and abrupt transfers of wealth to a pattern that extended back years, all revolving around one man who believed he had outsmarted the law. Once arrested, Haigh offered bizarre confessions, at times volunteering details as if eager to impress. But his confidence never fully returned. For the first time, the acid had not erased all traces. The dentures, the dry cleaning ticket, and the fragments washed through his drains stood against him. These were not elaborate finds, just overlooked everyday items that contradicted his image of precision and certainty. Olive's death proved not only his brutality, but also his fallibility. Olive Duran Deacon was the wrong target for his method. Her disappearance could not be disguised. Her friends could not be silenced through excuses, and her remains could not be destroyed entirely by a chemical bath. Forensic science and simple observation succeeded where his careful planning failed, and with evidence firmly in hand, the law had what it needed to charge John George Haigh. This killing, unlike all the others, directly led to the trial that followed. Haigh, desperate to escape responsibility, would claim insanity and present visions that he said justified his actions. The stage was set for one of Britain's most notorious courtrooms, where his attempt to argue madness would be tested against the cold, logical record of fraud, murder, and the fragments he left behind. Could Haigh convince a jury that blood-drinking dreams excused his crimes? That was the story he carried into court in 1949. After his arrest, he admitted to killing multiple people, but claimed he was not in control of his actions. He described vivid dreams where he saw himself surrounded by blood, consumed by visions that told him he needed to kill. In his version, the murders were not about money, but about satisfying strange compulsions. He wanted the court to see him as insane, someone plagued by fantasies, not a calculating fraudster who had dissolved victims for financial gain. It was a dramatic plea, carefully chosen because he knew that if accepted, he could escape execution and spend his life in a hospital rather than a prison gallows. From the start, it was clear that the defense hoped to present Haigh as a man gripped by uncontrollable urges. His claims about drinking blood from his victims' bodies shocked the public, but they also drew the attention he wanted. The idea of vampirism captured imaginations and played directly into the court of public opinion. Reporters filled headlines with the notion of a vampire killer, and for a short time, Haigh's bizarre claims dominated the coverage. His lawyers attempted to frame his acts as those of a man detached from reality, influenced by nightmares, rituals, and visions that stretched back to his youth. It was a portrait that relied on eccentricity and mystery. If the jury believed it, he might avoid death. But the courtroom was not swayed easily by stories. The prosecution shifted focus back to Haigh's actions, calculated, deliberate, and financially motivated. They pointed out how each of his so-called visions seemed to align with a pattern of acquiring wealth from his victims. He targeted people with assets, lured them to isolated workshops, and forged signatures after their deaths. Those were not the choices of a man broken by hallucinations, but of one rationally pursuing profit. Haigh's effort to tie himself to dreams and rituals looked weaker with every detail the prosecutors revealed. In addition to dismantling his narrative, the prosecution presented evidence of his meticulous planning, renting workshops with proper drainage, purchasing drums, and obtaining large quantities of sulfuric acid required time, money, and organization. Each step suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. The idea that he killed under the influence of a sudden dream or uncontrollable urge grew difficult to accept. Witnesses also came forward to describe his behavior before and after the killings. He had spoken about business arrangements, forged paperwork, and tried to collect rents, all with clarity of mind. That was not the behavior of a man disconnected from reality, but of one using violence to secure fraud. Haigh's own words also weakened his case. During questioning, he openly admitted to several murders, but not from guilt. Rather, he described the acts in detail, as if he wanted to impress investigators. There was little sign of confusion or delusion in those accounts. Instead, they demonstrated pride in his efficiency and his so-called perfect method of body disposal. In court, these admissions made it plain that he understood what he was doing. They did not support a narrative of insanity, only arrogance. His conduct both before and after the crimes made it easy for attorneys to show that he was methodical, not unhinged. The defense, hoping to salvage the case, relied heavily on medical witnesses. Psychiatrists were brought in to discuss his supposed delusions and compulsions, citing his early dreams and his talk of blood rituals. But even in this, the cracks showed. Other experts testified that his overall actions pointed to a man fully aware of right and wrong and capable of controlling himself. The dreams may have been strange, but strange dreams did not equal insanity. The jury was asked to weigh whether his killings came from madness or cold planning. Context mattered too. Post-war Britain was still reeling from loss and hardship, but it was also a society determined to restore order. Crimes that stood out as senseless attracted harsh judgment, and Haigh's actions embodied senselessness on a grand scale. The press labelled him monstrous, not because of his claims about drinking blood, but because of the cruelty of dissolving bodies and leaving families without closure. The public mood was not sympathetic. People wanted punishment, not excuses. That atmosphere carried into the court and shaped the reception of his defense. The jury, representing the public, did not see him as someone to pity. When the prosecution tied everything together, they emphasized that Haigh's murders followed his frauds step for step. First came the trust, then the killing, then the acid bath, and finally the forged papers to profit. There was nothing random or unpredictable about it. Each victim had assets he wanted. Each was dissolved in workshops specially prepared for concealment. There was no evidence that hallucinations drove him to attack strangers or to lash out without reason. Instead, his victims were chosen carefully, methodically, and always linked to financial gain. Insanity could not explain away such a clear sequence of actions. By the end of the trial, the jury had heard everything. His macabre confessions, the expert testimony, the evidence pulled from his workshops, and the testimonies about missing people linked to his fraud. It took them only minutes to reach a verdict. John George Haigh was found guilty of murder. For all his claims about blood, dreams, and compulsion, the court saw through it. The conclusion was clear. He was not out of touch with reality. He was in full possession of his intent, motivated by money, and entirely responsible for the deaths he caused. The sentence was death by hanging. It was customary at the time, and in August 1949, Haigh was executed at Wandsworth Prison. The very man who believed he had devised the perfect way to conceal his crimes ended at the gallows, exposed by overlooked fragments and his own arrogance. In the end, none of his rituals, visions, or elaborate claims could save him. His death closed the chapter on one of Britain's most notorious criminal cases, but the echoes of it carried forward. The Haigh trial did more than convict a killer. It demonstrated how courts could secure a murder conviction without a complete body. Before, the doctrine of no body, no crime was often repeated. But with advances in forensic methods and evidence like denture fragments, chemical traces, and personal possessions, prosecutors proved that lack of a whole body did not mean lack of proof. In Haigh's case, it was enough to show what he left behind, however small, and to connect those remains with the missing victims. That legal development was significant, influencing how future cases were prosecuted. The execution closed Haigh's personal story, but it opened wider debates about trust, fraud, and the terrifying possibility of murder as an extension of financial crime. He was not a killer driven by sudden rage. He was a fraudster who calculated that murder was the best way to continue his scams safely. The trial exposed this reality and reminded society that greed could grow into violence. As the rope was placed around his neck, the illusion he had built of a brilliant criminal above the law was finally shattered. From then on, he lived only in the history books, not as the vampire figure he liked to pretend, but as a man who believed acid could erase his crimes, only to be defeated by fragments, evidence, and human vigilance. What lessons does this case still hold, decades later? The crimes of John George Haigh did not end with his execution. His story continued to echo across law enforcement, the courts, and even in popular culture. Officially, he was convicted of 6 murders: William McSwan, Donald and Amy McSwan, Archibald and Rosalie Henderson, and Olive Duran Deacon. These were the victims the police could connect to physical evidence, fraudulent documents, and clear patterns of disappearance. But there were more claims, whispered by Haigh himself after his arrest. He boasted of killing 3 others, bringing the number to 9, though no proof was ever found. Whether or not those additional killings were real, the suggestion alone deepened public fascination. For some, it painted him not just as a fraudster turned killer, but as a predator comfortable exaggerating his own scale to appear fearsome. The uncertainty kept his case alive long after the trial ended. One of the first major impacts was seen in how courts thought about evidence. Before Haigh, many people repeated the idea that, without a body, no conviction was possible. But his murders challenged that assumption. In Olive Duran Deacon's case, almost nothing remained but a few bone fragments, denture pieces, and residue tested for human fat. The court still convicted him. For jurors, these fragments were enough to prove death and to link Haigh directly. That legal outcome showed both lawyers and the public that a total body was not needed to reach a verdict. Traces, even small ones, could form the backbone of a murder case. Legal historians later pointed to this trial when discussing the shift toward allowing forensic science and fragmentary findings as sufficient evidence. It became an early lesson in expanding how guilt could be proven, even when a murderer attempted the most extreme methods of erasure. For forensic awareness, the case demonstrated how chemistry intersected with law. Sulfuric acid could hide flesh, but it could not make fragments of metal or dentures vanish completely. Scientists tested the sludge left at Haigh's workshop, identifying minerals, fats, and materials that pointed clearly to human remains. This carried a message that any attempt to create the so-called perfect crime was flawed. Something always lasted. That idea grew into a guiding principle for later forensic work, that every act leaves a trace, even when chemicals, destruction, or erasure are used. Today, crime laboratories use far more advanced techniques, but the principle is the same. Haigh's case provided one of Britain's most memorable demonstrations of this truth. Outside courtrooms, the public absorbed the story in a different way. Newspapers in the late 1940s published lurid accounts of his use of acid baths, and his nickname, the acid bath murderer, never left him. He became a cultural figure, not because anyone admired him, but because the sheer horror of his method captured attention. People struggled to imagine how a man could calmly pour acid over a human body and watch as it dissolved. That image lasted far longer than the trial itself. Within months of his execution, his likeness appeared at Madame Tussauds in London. The waxwork displayed him with chilling realism, drawing thousands of visitors. It stood as a reminder that the line between curiosity and horror was thin, and people continued to come face to face with the figure who used acid as a murder weapon. In the years after, dramatizations and retellings sprang up. Haigh became a character in true crime books, radio discussions, films, and eventually television episodes that revisited his crimes. The way he combined fraud, charm, and murder gave creators a template to show how respectability could conceal violence. Each variation reinforced the danger of assuming appearances told the whole story. A polite man in a suit, playing piano at dinner, might at the same time be planning to erase a family in acid. Decades later, his crimes remained present because the mix of deception and brutality was so unsettling. True crime production in Britain often cited his case as one of the most distinct, a reminder of how easily killers can hide behind ordinary faces. On a deeper level, Haigh's story illustrated how financial crime can grow into calculated violence. His murders were not born from sudden rage or accidents. They grew out of fraud, Each victim represented more than a life. They were also resources he could acquire if he eliminated anyone who might stand in his way. Fraud turned into a calculated business model, with murder as its protection. This connection drew attention from criminologists and psychologists who examined escalation, how crimes shift from lesser offences into darker, irreversible acts. Haigh stood as an example. Theft and forgery were the practice field, but eventually they required something more extreme to sustain themselves. His confidence with deception paved the road for lethal acts that seemed, for years, invisible. There was also a broader cultural lesson about the illusion of control. Haigh convinced himself that acid erased everything. In his mind, no witness and no body meant no conviction. Yet, for all his chemical planning, it was human vigilance, neighbours noticing absences, friends reporting disappearances, that triggered the investigation. And once police began to search his workshops, the acid was far from flawless. Dentures remained, paperwork carried mistakes, and everyday items like a dry cleaning ticket stayed in pockets. The lesson was unmistakable. Even the most carefully planned crime collapses under pressure because perfection is impossible. The cracks, human or material, always show. When people visit a waxwork, watch a dramatization, or read about Haigh in a history of crime, they see more than just one man's violence. They see the clash of imagination and reality, the idea of a perfect disappearance met by the truth that fragments endure. That is why his name stayed present in Britain's crime memory, not because of a fascination with fraud, but because he pushed fraud into murder with an unusual method, and still failed. The failure itself was as instructive as the killing. It told jurists, scientists, and ordinary citizens alike that there is no formula to erase a human being without leaving something behind. For students of criminology, Haigh became a study in escalation and arrogance. He played roles: organist, chauffeur, solicitor, smooth businessman. Each role was performed with skill, yet each was hollow. His charm bought him trust, his fraud bought him money, and his murder bought him silence. But in the end, he was remembered not for success, but for the flaws he overlooked. The hook of his story, that acid could erase everything, became the hook of his downfall. Even today, discussions of white-collar crime often trace back to how greed, when unchecked, can grow into predation on lives themselves. His story keeps that warning alive. Culturally, fascination with Haigh remains because of the way his crimes fit into Britain's post-war climate. It was a time when everyday life mixed with disruption, when missing neighbours could be explained by war. Haigh exploited that system. The shift back to stability after the war made his final crime stand out even more sharply. People saw that stability itself exposed him. Once life grew more orderly, disappearances could not be slipped past communities, and that contrast between wartime cover and post-war accountability gave the case its distinct shape. It is part of why Olive Duran-Deacon's disappearance hit differently than those before, and why her friends' reports became the critical undoing of his cycle. What remains today is the reminder that Haigh should not be remembered only as a killer. His story is better understood as a study of how crimes escalate, of how fraud can darken into murder, and of how a myth of perfect concealment always breaks. His case lives as much in classrooms as in museums. Lawyers, forensic scientists, criminologists, and writers all continue to point back to him when explaining how small traces dismantle large illusions. He was a man who thought chemistry could erase humanity itself. But dentures, receipts, and the memories of ordinary people did what he thought acid destroyed. They brought his victims back into view. And looking at today's world, it is sobering to realize how much more quickly his crimes would unravel under modern forensic science. DNA analysis, chemical testing, digital tracking of records, and advanced surveillance would close the gaps that Haigh once relied on. The misplaced confidence he had in acid as a solution could not withstand modern scrutiny. The very thought of planning such vanishing acts today ends before it begins, not because greed and deception have vanished, but because science now leaves almost no place for such illusions to hide.